just?
Big damn hero, sir!
Ain't we just?
I still remember the first time I watched Firefly. I didn't understand everything, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. I remember sitting in front of the screen feeling slightly confused, seeing cowboys shooting guns in spaceships that sounded like old truck engines and characters talking to each other as if they had lived together their entire lives. I don't clearly remember what that episode was about, but I remember Inara Serra very clearly, her calm gaze, her gentle voice, and the way the entire ship treated her with absolute respect. At the time, I simply thought Inara was a beautiful, intelligent, and mysterious female character. Only much later did I realize that Firefly had done something almost unthinkable for American television in the early 2000s. Few people know that Inara Serra was not a lover, not a victim, but a companion. A high-class courtesan protected by law with the right to refuse clients with social status and never judged by the show itself. And it was precisely this portrayal that terrified Fox. But that was only the surface. You wouldn't believe that Fox once forced Firefly to obscure Inara's profession and cut scenes that expressed her sexual agency out of fear that audiences might empathize with a courtesan. Nathan Fillion even bluntly said that Morena Baccarin was disgusting because she almost didn't have to act at all, simply showing up was enough to make people uncomfortable. Or that Fox aired Firefly out of order from the very first episode, leaving audiences unable to understand what this world was, and then used that very confusion as the reason to cancel the series. And that is just one of many things that Firefly was never allowed to fully say. Today, we are going to open again the darkest and strangest behind-the-scenes doors of Firefly. 20. Big Damn Heroes. The improvised moment that defined Firefly. If you watched Firefly from its earliest days, you probably still remember that feeling the Serenity appears amid smoke and gunfire. The door opens and Malcolm Reynolds steps forward, not aggressively, not delivering a long speech. Just 4 words spoken softly, but enough to freeze the entire scene. Big damn heroes, sir. What's interesting is that this moment was never in the script. In the original draft, Mal was only supposed to reply to the Alliance officer with a generic procedural line of resistance. But right there on set, Nathan Fillion made a different choice. He broke away from what was written on the page and delivered a short, slightly growled line perfectly in character for Mal Reynolds' blunt sarcastic, yet full of presence. Joss Whedon immediately recognized that this was not an ordinary line, but a moment that truly hit the nerve of the character. He kept it exactly as it was, no revisions, no additions, no explanations. From then on, those 4 words became something any browncoat would instantly recognize, appearing on t-shirts, posters, autographs, and repeated for more than 2 decades as an unofficial badge of identity for the fan community. It's the kind of line that when you hear it again, you don't just remember the scene. You remember the feeling of watching Firefly for the first time when you realized these people are not Hollywood-style heroes, but they are still heroes in their own way. 19. Inara Serra, the high-class courtesan role that sparked intense controversy when the show aired. Do you remember how Inara Serra appeared on the Serenity Never Loud, Never Showy, always speaking softly, dressing modestly, and seemingly always maintaining a very personal distance from those around her? At the time, many viewers could sense that Inara was different, but found it hard to name exactly what made her so. Only later in hindsight did people realize that Firefly had done something almost unprecedented on American television in the early 2000s. In the world of the series, Inara was not a lover, not a victim, but a companion. A high-class courtesan, formally trained, educated with the right to refuse clients with social status, and respected by the upper class. This was not a minor detail, but a deliberate choice by Joss Whedon, turning a profession, usually stigmatized, into a symbol of autonomy and personal dignity. And that was precisely what terrified Fox. From the development stage onward, the concept of the companion was considered too sensitive for primetime television. The network repeatedly demanded that Inara's profession be obscured, that direct terminology be avoided, that scenes expressing her sexual agency be limited, and that relationships involving Inara be portrayed in a more safe manner. Some story elements were rewritten, others were removed entirely even though they existed in the original concept. The result was a paradox. Inara was both one of the most progressive characters on television at the time and one of the most tightly controlled. For some viewers, she was unsettling because she shattered familiar moral frameworks. For Fox, she went too far. And for Firefly fans, it was precisely this tension that made Inara Serra one of the most complex, memorable and controversial characters in the series, even though she was never allowed to appear in full as she was originally written. 18. Neil Patrick Harris was once very close to playing Simon Tam. There are faces so familiar that audiences don't need to remember a name. Seeing them is enough to recognize them instantly. Neil Patrick Harris is one of those faces. For many American TV viewers in the early 2000s, he was inseparably associated with the image of a young, intelligent, quick-witted doctor who appeared regularly on television for many years. And because of that, when Firefly once considered him for the role of Simon Tam, the issue wasn't talent, it was audience memory. It may sound hard to imagine, but there was a very serious point at which Neil Patrick Harris stood on the verge of becoming Dr. Simon Tam. He auditioned for the role, and according to people on the production team, he did very well. Not in a good enough to pass way, but convincingly enough to be genuinely considered. The problem lay in his image. In the early 2000s, Neil Patrick Harris was still tightly bound to the shadow of Doogie Howser, the brilliant child prodigy doctor, with a clearly comedic tone. Simon Tam in Firefly, by contrast, was a completely different person. Quiet, haunted, constantly living in a state of tension over his sister while being hunted by the Alliance. The producers worried that audiences wouldn't be able to forget Doogie in order to believe in an underground surgeon fleeing aboard a battered old ship. In the end, they arrived at a familiar Hollywood conclusion: he was better suited to comedy. And indeed, it's very difficult to imagine Doogie Howser bending over to perform surgery in Serenity's cargo bay, or standing silently watching River with eyes full of guilt. The role was therefore given to Sean Maher, who brought to Simon Tam a sense of fragility, heaviness, and the feeling of not belonging to this world. But the idea that Firefly almost had Neil Patrick Harris remains an intriguing what-if, one of those small turning points that could have given the series a completely different tone. 17. Inara Serra was not originally played by Morena Baccarin. Today, Morena Baccarin is almost inseparable from the image of Inara Serra. But few people know that she was not the original choice for the role. The actress first cast was Rebecca Gayheart, and she even completed filming the pilot episode. On paper, everything seemed fine. Gayheart met all the requirements in terms of appearance experience and the demeanour described in the script. But when the crew reviewed the first raw dailies, a hard-to-name feeling began to emerge. There was no obvious mistake, no scene that was clearly wrong, the chemistry simply wasn't there. In Hollywood language, that's often a gentle way of saying that the character wasn't alive. The decision came fairly quickly, and was also quite painful to recast the role of Inara entirely. All footage with Gayheart was discarded, and the production started over from scratch with Morena Baccarin. When Baccarin stepped in, Inara Serra truly took shape, calmer, more reserved, and carrying an inner weight that made the character feel both approachable and distant, exactly in the way Firefly needed. That also means that in some parallel universe, Firefly features Neil Patrick Harris aboard the Serenity and Rebecca Gayheart as Inara. And very likely that version would have carried far more sitcom energy than a melancholic space western ever needed. 16. Zac Efron was once considered for a young Simon Tam. If you remember the episode Safe, you may still recall the image of a skinny boy with anxious eyes standing close to Simon Tam during the brief but very quiet moments of the episode. That was Zac Efron at just 13 years old, long before he became a familiar face on the Disney Channel, and the national crush of an entire generation. The role lasted less than 30 seconds on screen. There was no climax, no memorable dialogue, just a very small moment in an already subdued episode. But for Zac Efron, it was the first time he stepped into a major television production. Efron later admitted that when he went to the casting, he didn't even know what Firefly was, simply thinking it was a show about doctors in space. 20 years later, it is ironic that those quiet 30 seconds are still frequently mentioned in interviews, sometimes even more than films in which he played leading roles. For Firefly fans, it's a fun detail. For Zac Efron, it's a small milestone that has never disappeared from his career journey. 15. Star Wars ships. Hidden inside Firefly. Have you ever watched Firefly late at night replaying an old episode just to have something on and then suddenly stopped rewinding because something on screen felt off? Not the plot, not the dialogue, but a familiar shape gliding through the background of space so fast that you wonder if you imagined it. That feeling is very similar to rewatching old Star Wars VHS tapes. As a kid, you believe you know every frame by heart, yet you still find yourself thinking, wait, was this scene always here? It was precisely in such blink and you miss it moments that Firefly's visual effects team secretly slipped in ship models from Star Wars. A subtle joke meant only for those who truly live with sci-fi. There was no announcement, no explanation in the show. They appear as true Easter eggs, fleeting tiny, and only for viewers patient enough to notice. A moment when a familiar ship from that faraway galaxy seems to have wandered into another universe. For sci-fi fans, this detail quickly became a light-hearted anecdote. Some joked that the Millennium Falcon had flown too far off its usual route, wondering why it ended up drifting alongside the Serenity. And who knows, perhaps somewhere in a cargo bay, Han Solo is still frozen, waiting for a completely different story to begin. 14. Alliance. Uniforms actually came from Starship Troopers. Try to recall the feeling the first time you saw the Alliance appear in Firefly. Without a single line of dialogue, the uniforms alone were enough to send a chill down your spine. Rigid, sharp-edged, and utterly lacking the look of a righteous side. Many viewers couldn't quite put their finger on why, only that they felt they had seen this somewhere before. That sense of familiarity closely resembled watching Starship Troopers again from the late 1990s. The same style of military uniforms, the same emotionless stares, the same order wrapped in the language of protecting humanity. And it turns out that wasn't a coincidence. With Firefly's budget constantly under tight constraints, the costume department had to take the most practical approach, reusing existing costumes. The source chosen was the uniforms from Starship Troopers 1997, a film that also deals with the military power and militarism polished with lofty rhetoric. Ironically, a decision born of financial limitation turned out to be eerily fitting. Both Firefly and Starship Troopers depict systems where individuals are crushed by discipline and command. When those uniforms appear in Firefly, they don't just save money, they also carry with them a visual memory and a sense of threat that had already been deeply imprinted. Sometimes it is precisely a lack of budget that forces a production to make choices it might never have considered if money were plentiful. And in this case, being short on funds accidentally resulted in a perfect artistic decision. 13. Serenity was more than a setting. It was a real ship you could walk through. There is something that is very difficult to explain to younger audiences today. The feeling of being inside a television space. Not looking at it, but being with it, Firefly achieved that feeling through the Serenity. The narrow corridors, the cramped galley, the cluttered cargo hold, and the cockpit full of scratches were not built to look realistic. They were built to be used. Serenity was a continuous structure spread across two large sound stages where actors could walk from the bow to the stern without the camera needing to stop. This was a very old-school approach to filmmaking: build less, but build it right, accepting extra labour instead of relying on editing to deceive the eye. The result was that the ship wasn't just a set but became a living space carrying with it breath, the sound of metal, and a very human sense of confinement. When Firefly was cancelled, Serenity was dismantled as well. But when the film Serenity was greenlit, the decision was made so quickly it almost didn't require discussion rebuild everything. Some things can't be recreated with an equivalent version because they were already right the first time. 12. Fox aired Firefly out of order and the price it paid. In the early 2000s, American television still operated by a very familiar rule: turn on the TV after dinner. Watch an episode, and if you didn't understand it within the first 5 minutes, change the channel. It was a time when audiences weren't used to complex world building. There was no streaming to rewatch the previous episode, and there certainly wasn't the idea that you should be patient and that everything would be explained later. Firefly was born at exactly that moment, and Fox treated it like a series that could be watched in isolated episodes. The original pilot Serenity was designed by Joss Whedon as a complete blueprint, introducing the Civil War. The concept of the Browncoats, the Alliance, and the reasons these people were forced to live together on a battered old ship. But Fox considered the episode too slow, too talky, and lacking action for prime time. Instead of airing the pilot, they asked Whedon to write a new episode that was easier to watch and more action-oriented, The Train Job. And that episode was broadcast first. The problem was that The Train Job assumed the audience already understood Firefly, when in reality, they had never been given any foundation at all. The consequences came quickly. Viewers didn't understand who Mal was, why he hated the Alliance, what the Browncoats were, or why this group of people on an old ship was worth caring about. Ratings dropped after just a few episodes, not because Firefly was bad, but because it was being told the wrong way. The irony is that when Firefly was later released on DVD in the correct order, audience reactions completely reversed. Many people admitted that only after watching the pilot first did they truly understand and fall in love with the show. Fox's scheduling mistake has since been frequently cited as a classic example of how network interference can kill an entire carefully built fictional world. 11. The behind-the-scenes joke called Summer that fans often miss. Anyone who has watched Firefly closely probably remembers that feeling. There are moments when River Tam starts speaking and all you can do is sit still and listen. Not because you fully understand her, but because it feels like if you blink, you'll miss something important. That's how it feels on screen. On set, the feeling was even stronger. Whenever an actor forgot a line, missed a beat, or simply ruined a take, the Firefly crew had an almost automatic reaction. Everyone would shout, "Summer!" as if all disorder in the universe could be blamed on that small, quiet girl. It was an inside joke aimed at Summer Glau, who carried the most difficult lines in the series. Illogical, layered with subtext, and disconnected from normal emotional rhythms. While other actors could still ask, "Am I angry here?" or "Am I afraid Summer had to deliver lines?" as if River's brain were broadcasting on an entirely different frequency. The joke. Summer gradually became a catchphrase on set and years later was still being mentioned at fan conventions. Because if there was anyone the crew both respected and teased at the same time, it was the person who had to say lines that made everyone pretend they understood, and then nod along anyway. 10. The River Tam Academy episode that was never aired. Do you remember those moments when River Tam curled up in a corner of the ship whispering fragmented sentences, or the panicked look in her eyes whenever the Alliance was mentioned? In truth, those moments were only the surface of a story that was never fully told. There were once plans for a standalone episode tentatively titled Dead or Alive, meant to go straight into River's past. The experiments at the Academy, how the Alliance destroyed a brilliant young woman and why she could never truly be at peace in this world. It was considered a key episode for understanding River not just as an eccentric character, but as a surviving victim of an entire system. But that episode was never filmed. Firefly was cancelled before the plan could take shape. The only thing left, according to people on the production team, was an unfinished script, kept somewhere like a lost puzzle piece. And for fans, that episode exists much like River Tam herself, a fractured memory, a painful story we only hear through fragments, and perhaps because of that, it is all the more haunting. 9. How the $100,000 Serenity model was created. There is a very particular feeling when watching Firefly that many older viewers recognize immediately. The ship doesn't drift through space, it has weight. Every time Serenity appears, its hull catches the light differently. The metal isn't glossy, and the engines shudder as if tired after a long journey. This is a sensation that early 2000s computer graphics struggled to fake. The reason is simple. Serenity in space was not CGI, but a handcrafted physical model built at an estimated cost of around $100,000. At the time, this was an enormous investment for a television series that wasn't even guaranteed to survive its first season. But to the crew, Serenity was more than a means of transportation. It was a home, a shelter, the thing that kept a broken group of people together. That's why the ship had to look battered, patched up, and worn by years of drifting. When Firefly was cancelled early, that model suddenly became a symbol of an unfinished dream. Yet it didn't disappear. Serenity continued to appear at conventions, exhibitions, and in the collective memory of fans. Countless replicas were created from small shelf models to elaborate homemade versions as a way of preserving the real feeling of a time in television when everything was still made by hand. 8. Earth. That was the darkest detail in Firefly. In the world of Firefly, there is something that is almost never mentioned yet present everywhere. Earth is no longer the centre of the story. The series never explains what happened to humanity's home planet. There is no scene of destruction, no flashbacks, no lengthy exposition. Earth is simply left behind. This is not a flaw in the show's world building, but a deliberate choice by Joss Whedon. He didn't want the story pulled back into the past or trapped in nostalgia about where we came from. In Firefly, what matters more is what people have become after being forced to leave home. That mystery exists as an intentional void large enough for viewers to fill with their own imagination. Perhaps Earth is dead. Perhaps it was abandoned. Or perhaps it is still there, just no longer meaningful. More than 2 decades later, the question is still debated within the fan community, proving that sometimes what is left untold is what endures the longest. 7. The Firefly DVD. Once went into space. There is a very familiar moment when watching Firefly Serenity glides through the darkness of space, and the viewer suddenly realizes they are wishing they could step aboard that ship. Have you ever felt that way too? In 2007, astronaut Stephen Ray Swanson brought a Firefly DVD set aboard the International Space Station. Not as a display item, not as a keepsake, but to watch the entire series in orbit above Earth. In a zero-gravity environment amid the silent rotations around the blue planet, Firefly was replayed as a story about drifters among the stars. For the fan community, this moment carried a very specific meaning. A series that was cancelled early, once considered not engaging enough for broadcast television, was now being watched in actual space. Not many sci-fi series can say they've left Earth in that way, and for Firefly, it feels like a belated confirmation. Some stories don't need a long life on television, they just need to be carried far enough. 6. Nathan Fillion. Had a Han Solo shrine on set. Have you watched Firefly enough times to feel that something looks strangely familiar when you spot an object on screen that seems like it exists in the real world? If the answer is yes, then you may have once glanced through Serenity's cargo bay and felt a sense of déjà vu. A motionless figure, encased in a frozen block, briefly visible behind the crates, disappearing before you're even sure what you just saw. That wasn't an illusion. At Nathan Fillion's request, the crew hung a model of Han Solo frozen in carbonite inside Serenity's cargo bay. There's no dialogue calling attention to it, no close-up shot, just a quiet detail for sharp-eyed viewers. For Fillion, this was a direct tribute to the classic sci-fi rogue archetype, the outlaw who lives by his own rules, forever standing on the line between hero and troublemaker. Han Solo was the predecessor. Malcolm Reynolds is the successor. The detail appears repeatedly throughout the series like a wink to fans, and also as an acknowledgement that Firefly doesn't exist in a vacuum. It was born from a love of old adventure stories and from the desire to retell them in a new way. 5. When Firefly accidentally created the perfect Star Wars crossover. Do you sense something very familiar in Firefly? Outlaws a battered old ship, shady cargo runs, and the feeling of always being chased by some empire just behind you. If your answer is yes, you're not imagining it. Firefly wasn't just influenced by Star Wars, it was created by people who grew up with Star Wars. Between small details that seem like behind-the-scenes jokes, Star Wars ships secretly appearing in a few space shots, a frozen Han Solo model hanging quietly in Serenity's cargo bay, Firefly created an unofficial yet perfect crossover of its own. No announcements, no licensing, just silent nods exchanged between people who share the same love for sci-fi. What makes that crossover special isn't how showy it is, but how natural it feels. It isn't a marketing trick, but the trace of a filmmaking team that genuinely loved the world they were drawing inspiration from. A group of artists who knew they were standing on the shoulders of giants and weren't afraid to bow in respect. And perhaps that's why Firefly still lives on. Not because of how long it ran on air, but because it was built from a sincere love for sci-fi, a language that fans in any galaxy can recognize instantly. 4. Firefly was almost turned into a harmless family show for prime time. Few people know that during the pre-production stage, Fox tried to shape Firefly into a family-friendly series, something that ran completely counter to the show's true nature. The demands sent down to the production team sounded very familiar to early 2000s. American television. Reduce violence, soften. Complex relationships. Avoid uncomfortable moral conflicts, and above all, don't let the main character become too bitter or openly resistant to authority. In the original writing, Malcolm Reynolds was a former soldier carrying deep psychological wounds, having lost faith in righteous causes and no longer believing that the winners were necessarily right. But Fox repeatedly pushed to soften Mal, make him less pessimistic, less dangerous, less like a resentful, defeated man, and more like a familiar television hero. The irony is that this very uncomfortableness was the soul of Firefly. When those rough edges were filed down, the series stopped being a story about survivors of defeat and became just another harmless space adventure, something American television already had in abundance. Firefly didn't fail because it was too dark, too complex, or too unconventional. It failed because it was forced to become something it was never meant to be. And when audiences later watched Firefly in its complete form, uncensored and unsmoothed, they finally realized this was never a family series. It was a story about freedom loss and people who no longer believed in polished slogans. 3. How Firefly was influenced by American Civil War novels. From the very first episodes, Firefly creates a strange feeling. You're watching sci-fi, but the spirit of the story feels familiar, like an old historical novel. Defeated drifters carrying lost pride, living in a world whose laws are written by the victors. That feeling doesn't come from outer space, but from the American Civil War. Joss Whedon has acknowledged that he drew direct inspiration from novels about the American South. After the Civil War, stories centered on defeated Confederate soldiers forced to live under the authority of a government they didn't trust. Malcolm Reynolds is that image projected into the future, a former browncoat veteran, defeated, uncelebrated, and forced to move on in a world that no longer has room for old ideals. This explains why Firefly doesn't tell a story about heroic victory. It tells the story of people who survived defeat. People who carry memories of a war never mentioned in official history books, who have to scrape by on the fringes of society doing shady jobs just to survive without kneeling. By borrowing the structure and spirit of American Civil War literature, Firefly makes its world feel historically weighty, even though it never existed. You don't need to know the details of the Unification War, you only need to recognize something deeply familiar. History is always written by the winners, and the losers must find their own way to keep living. That choice is what made Firefly different. It doesn't ask, "How did we win?" It asks, "Who are we after we've lost?" 2. How Firefly failed on television but became a cult series. On broadcast television, Firefly was a very literal failure, low ratings, a chaotic broadcast schedule and cancellation before audiences even understood what they were watching. But strangely enough, once it disappeared from TV, Firefly began to live. DVD sales were unexpectedly strong. Fan community screenings grew larger. Lines of dialogue started being quoted like a private code. People didn't just watch Firefly, they recognized one another through having watched it. That was the moment a work stepped outside the mainstream system and entered the realm of cult. Unlike series that succeed through heavy promotion, Firefly spread slowly and quietly through word of mouth, through marathon viewing nights, through the shared feeling of, how did this get cancelled? The lack too few episodes. No complete ending is precisely what made the series something worth holding on to. 1. Why a series with only 14 episodes? Is still considered a sci-fi legend, some series run for hundreds of episodes and are quickly forgotten. Firefly, with only 14 episodes, is still mentioned whenever people talk about what sci-fi television can do. The reason isn't the number of episodes, but the density of ideas. In those 14 episodes, Firefly builds an entire post-war world. A power system, a ship that functions as a family, and characters who are never neatly defined as heroes or villains. There was no time to wander. The series had to go straight to what mattered most. Being cancelled early also accidentally protected Firefly from repetition decline or unnecessary prolonging. There's no weak season, no period of watching just to finish it. Every episode feels unfinished yet complete, as if it hadn't said everything but had said exactly what needed to be said. And perhaps that's why more than 2 decades later, Firefly is still called a legend. Not because it lasted a long time, but because it ended before it ever had the chance to become ordinary. Firefly burned brightly and went out too soon, but its legacy has never disappeared. Not because of Fox or ratings, but because of the people who created it and the viewers who have kept it alive for more than 2 decades. So what about you? Which detail in these stories surprised you the most? Would you want Firefly to return, or are you satisfied with it remaining perfect as it is? Leave a comment below, and if you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to like, share and subscribe so we can continue uncovering more memorable behind-the-scenes stories. Thank you for watching.